Well, welcome everybody. My name is Molly Cronin and I'm the host of Artwork. While our NASCAD community is a global one, our school and subsequently our talks are hosted in Chibuktuk, Mi'kmaq on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We're honored to gather, speak, and make artwork here. Each month, I have the extreme privilege of chatting with some of our alum about where their careers and practices have taken them after their time at NASCAD. And this month, I'm so excited to be chatting with Benny Welter Nolan, BFA 2011, and Tori Fleming, BFA 2013, which is fun because we're all kind of like around the same time graduates. So it's so nice to have you guys. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So to get us started, maybe Tori, we'll start with you. Can you give us a little introduction into who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Yeah, it's a really big question. Um, so I'm Tori Fleming. I have been working as an arts administrator, curator, programmer around media art for the last like 10, 15 years. I really like to think of my work as sort of the Venn diagram of media art and filmmaking. I'm somewhere in that little space in the middle is where I tend to hang out. Um, I went to NASCAD for painting and ended up here. So that was a bit of a weird pathway, but have worked with a lot of the festivals in town. Most people know me because up until really recently, worked at the Center for Art Tapes for uh, 10 years, full decade. And I've recently moved over to the Atlantic International Film Festival. So really embedded in that media arts community.
Absolutely. Congratulations on the new role.
Thank you.
All right, Benny, same question to you. Who are you?
Yeah.
What do you do? All that.
I'm Benny Wilcher Nolan. I use they, them pronouns. Right now, I'm the new executive director at Impact Organizations of Nova Scotia, which is the umbrella of nonprofit organizations across the province. We support with HR and kind of organizational structure, which is something I'm super nerdy about because in my art practice, really my art practice right now consists of a lot of organizing events, parties, and fun times as an art practice, as a balance to the administration mostly. But there's a lot of through line between organizing a party and organizing an advocacy situation. Um, so yeah, that's a bit about me. I graduated in 2011, and I had originally studied printmaking at NASCAD, and I'm sure that we can get into this later, but there are some applicable skills that transferred. Printmaking wasn't really one of them.
Well, actually, that's my next question is to ask you both to kind of reflect on your time at NASCAD and tell us a bit about what you were learning and what you was kind of getting you excited about making, and maybe if that changed while you were in school. So, Benny, you said that printmaking was your first love or interest at NASCAD. Can you tell us about what your time was like while you were in school?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that the reason why I was drawn to printmaking was because it was such a political department.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the focus there among the staff and students was on kind of propaganda messaging. And that I think is part of the through line for me. And in trying to actually motivate people with imagery and culture, because that's something that I'm really realizing more and more as I age and I'm more involved in administration and at higher levels of government, is that it's not actually politics that changes culture, it's culture that changes politics. So we need to start with culture in order to change things in the systems. So that's really my motivation for going to art school, was trying to change that culture piece. And I think the where I kind of came through with that was through student organizing. So I was really involved with SunSCAD, and that really put me on a path towards leadership. And so I would say that my experience at NASCAD wasn't just kind of in the classroom, it was also in the community. And that really set me up for success.
Yeah, I think that really rings true. I think a lot of NASCAD students are politically engaged, and you see it like very ingrained in the politics of being an art student. So I think that makes perfect sense. Tori, can you tell us a little bit about your time at NASCAD and what you were interested in and working on?
Yeah, I went to NASCAD to study painting and did do a lot of painting. But then while I was there, did a little bit of everything else and found a particular, like I was just really excited about the possibility of using all these technologies that I had never had access to before. Like the print studio, all of the stuff that was in multimedia, the particularly celluloid film I was really interested in at the time. So I was really just there to soak up whatever was available to me in that space. Uh, and I ended up kind of spending a lot of time in the film department, but never really could commit to the film major. Just was sort of just hanging out. And
Mhm.
then after, it felt like I wasn't ready to graduate. It just 4 years was over, and suddenly it was time. And I ended up having an interdisciplinary degree because I hadn't really done anything well enough to get a major. And for a long time, I think like genuinely 5 years after my time at NASCAD, I thought that I had like kind of done it wrong, and that had sort of messed me up because I hadn't like picked the career and done the thing. And now I think I have enough perspective to realize that like nothing is constant, and actually that was the best use of my time and the truest form of who I am. And I still, to this day, my practice is always evolving and responding to the limitations of my life. So, more recently, I've been really focusing on narrative filmmaking and working with a crew and doing those sorts of things. But now I've had two kids, and it's a lot harder to spend 12 to 16-hour days for weeks at a time with other people. So, the practice evolves. So, actually, I think learning this sort of idea that like my practice is a sort of core philosophy that sits within me that I get to do whatever I want with rather than trade that I have learned was a
Mhm.
really special thing I got from NASCAD that I don't think I had the space to understand at the time. And I frequently now think about how much I don't want a master's, I want to do a BFA again. Like I want to go back and just like mess around for a while. And unfortunately, I think that like the time that we went to school, that was like a bit more of a beautiful time to do that because I was paying $400 for rent. I don't think that freedom
Yes.
exists anymore.
Yeah.
And that makes me like really, really profoundly bummed out.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that's like one of the most beautiful gifts NASCAD gave me and gave a lot of people was just like extensive space to really mess up and make a lot of bad art because I think that's important before the good art.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for bad art. And also I think like getting over that scarcity mentality of thinking like I only have access to these things while I'm in art school and I only will have the time to do this while I'm in art school and thinking that your education has to be like only happening in those for however many years. So yeah, reminding us that our practice is also about like continuing to learn and continuing to experiment and that education goes on far longer than we are students in the formal sense.
Mhm.
Um, sorry, that was my little tangent in response. But I'd love to hear a bit about how you both found yourself in administrative roles following your time at NASCAD. I'm in Fredericton today, and there's a conference here of administrators, and they were coming into the gallery where I was yesterday, and they all had really interesting things to say and one of them noted that a lot of administrators happen to be academics and artists. Like it's a very common thing in that role. So I'd love to hear from both of you how you found yourself kind of moving from NASCAD to these uh, these roles in administration and kind of organization. Benny, what was that trajectory like for you specifically?
Um, that honestly was a very smooth transition for
Yeah.
me. And that's very privileged of me to say because I had had these leadership roles at SunSCAD that really set me up for work outside of the art context that I was in at NASCAD. And I had also like would always recommend to people who are really looking for work after school to do internships. I know it's a controversial space, but my internship at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia also really set me up for success. So that when there was a position that opened up as a programming coordinator at Visual Arts Nova Scotia, I already had work experience that was directly related.
Mhm.
And so having that work experience kind of outside of my practice and art degree, I think is really what like set me apart from the other applicants, and really got me into that stream. And from there, then it became really easy to build on those skills. And this is the other thing I want to say about that in terms of like building those skills is that because of the roles that I was holding on SunSCAD, I was on a lot of boards, so a lot of volunteer boards. And that also really helped me understand organizational structure and what has to happen in order for systems to change. So that really helped me develop some of the more hard skills as well as the negotiation skills that I was going to need, for that like post grad experience. And I think that the one of the things that has been so valuable to me, in a leadership role, outside of the arts now, is like Tori was saying, that flexibility, and creative thinking. That is actually really hard to hire for now. As someone who like does a lot of hiring, it's like it's something that I'm noticing is a strength of NASCAD grads, is that there is a creativity and a willingness to experiment that isn't common in the workforce right now. There's a lot of desire for people to like just be told what to do, and there's not a lot of space for play. And so NASCAD really set me up with divergent thinking and being able to see the patterns and connect the dots, and then build the relationships around them. So I think that that's something that I really value from my time there, that I actually put into practice on a really regular basis in administration.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that, yeah, that absolutely speaks to the strengths of NASCAD's structure, and nice to hear that it's helpful in hiring. I know there's probably lots of recent grads who are encouraged to hear that. So
Yeah.
thanks, Penny. Tori, what about you? What was your trajectory like from art school into this work of administration?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with everything that Benny just said. I really, truly, wholeheartedly believe that like art school is better than business school for business. Like I always
100%.
believe that.
Yes.
And I think it's for all the reasons you just said. And I know I'm not answering your question, Molly, but I'll get there. But I just want to piggyback on that before we move on, that the other
Okay.
skill that NASCAD teaches you that makes you so good at business is that like you learn to treat rejection with curiosity rather than being wounded by it. Spending 4 years having people tear down your work, and
Yes.
maybe maybe it feels productive to you. I don't mean to say that in like a reductive way, but like having 4 years of people constantly tell you like this could be better, this could be better, this could be better. It teaches you how to defend yourself, how to think things through, how to take notes and understand like what is actually the core of this note that matters. Why am I getting different notes from other people that all add up to the same thing? And that critical thinking skill of being able to separate yourself from your work
Hmm.
is makes you incredible at business. So it makes you very good at it.
Yeah.
So, anyways, I do think it's really great in that way, and I would always recommend anyone go get an art degree rather than a business degree. But in terms of how I got here, after I graduated, I felt like completely. I had no idea what I was going to do. Like the last full year, I just made experimental films. Like I didn't know where I was going to go with that. And then I ended up working a bunch of reception jobs and just doing admin work, like assistance, scheduling, working at a lot of gyms, like being a Pilates studio person, like whatever I could get. And I saw it as just sort of like a way to pay the bills while I did the other stuff. So also piggybacking on what Benny said there, when I left those jobs, I was always like, I got to go be where the artists are. So I'm going to go be on the board of Nocturne, and I'm going to go hang out at CFAT with every spare moment I have, and really embedded myself into those sorts of like artist run culture communities that we have. And then next thing you know, when you have all of this admin experience from running like a medical office or whatever I was doing, then when you're on the board and they need somebody to coordinate a project, suddenly you have those skills.
Hmm.
So it did, in some ways, it feels like the most direct path possible because I was always putting myself into whatever room I can. But in other ways, it feels like I really just fell into it because the actual resume does not create a nice narrative.
And in those early days of like learning to be an administrator, did you have like people who were mentoring you or guiding you, or kind of like what were some of the learning curves that you experienced in those first days of project management, Tori?
I never had like one mentor, but I did have a lot of people who taught me, who like really went above and beyond and taught me a lot of skills. I think a lot of the opportunities that were given to me was because I had this base knowledge of having an internship at the Anna,
Mhm.
where Melanie Klossimo like really whipped me into shape on how to like do things properly
Mhm.
and in a way that will last. So I having that, and now I know that's at the time that wasn't formalized, but now you can do a certificate in
Yeah.
that mindset.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was really helpful. Um, but also I just spent a lot of time, and I still do this every time I'm at an arts event, especially if I'm like traveling and I can see people who aren't in my community. I always am thinking like, who in this room is living a life that I actually feel like jealous of? And
Mhm.
I think when I was younger, I was looking for people who had a good title.
Yeah.
Was like who's the curator of the National Gallery in this room? But now that I'm older and a mom and have more perspective on trying to enjoy my life, I'm looking
Mhm.
for like who seems to be balancing this and who doesn't seem that worried about paying their bills, and looking to those people, and also being like really realistic about that. And I know this is like a tricky thing to think about, but I try to always, when I'm in a big room, I always try to quickly think who's being paid to be here. And you
Mhm.
see some real quick patterns once you think about who's being paid and who's volunteering to be there. And then also I think, and who is not paying for their lifestyle? And when you start to think about the people that you find very successful and you want to emulate to them and you can't quite figure it out, but also then you figure out like, oh, actually, it turns out they have a husband who pays
Yep.
for everything, and maybe
Yep.
that's why I can't do that. Like that, I mean, that sounds depressing, but that was like really freeing for me to start being realistic about looking to people who are at the same starting line that I am.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And when you find people like that, I have found, and I've gotten much bolder with this since the pandemic, people will always answer your email. Like you would be surprised who will get a coffee with you, right? Like if you just write somebody an email and be like, your career is like fascinating. Can I buy you a coffee and ask you a bunch of questions? Or as I have learned post pandemic, can I go on a Zoom with you because you're in France? Like
Mhm.
50% of the time that works. And
Mhm.
people will just give you an hour of their time and tell you what they think you should be doing. So I do a lot of that.
Yeah, staying curious and like looking behind those curtains and like asking people questions.
Mhm.
Uh, that makes so much sense. And because like money is so like fraught in the art world, it's like such like a big distinction between like working artists, and then we're rubbing shoulders with like the uber wealthy so often. I think
Yeah.
like understanding what those financial systems are that are actually like happening in the room is a really good strategy, and figuring out like what we have access to as artists and admin, right?
Yes.
Benny, is any of this resonating with you, or is there anything you want to say
Huge.
about your early days of getting into this kind of work?
Oh, absolutely. I think like I was really privileged when I got into this work to have a lot of mentors and a lot of people that were like very delighted to help me out. You know, Michael McCormick and Peter Dykes and Brini Karas are all just extremely kind and generous humans, and like really I think set me up with an approach that has been sustainable for me as a person, where, you know, like it's not necessarily about the perfectionism of like getting it right, but like how does it feel? And what is the relationship that you're building, and like how are we being consistent and considerate? And that was like super, super helpful for me, especially having some experiences with like bosses that didn't work for me, that did have a bit of a perfectionism vibe. So having that alternative and that guidance was actually like super crucial for me. And also like to Tori's point, like in terms of like the money in the art world. And the like varying levels of privilege. My background has some privilege, but it's not financial privilege. So I actually really needed to have a job because I have a disability and they need a health plan. So like the art was on the back burner like right away, because I just needed to be like employed, even if it wasn't for like enough money to live. And I was still supported by a partner for a really long time. So like that was another financial privilege that I had, that I don't have anymore. That is like always a really interesting thing, even now as an executive director, when I'm comparing myself to other executive directors that have partners. And folks are just like, oh, like, how are you holding up? Like, it's been a really stressful time. Like, what are your resources? And I'm like, what my resources are is Uber Eats. I love Uber Eats. Like Mashawi has my back. I love them. They are supporting me. Favorite restaurants. But the one of the things that I learned recently in terms of like having more experience with like major fundraising initiatives, is that like folks with a lot of money and a lot of privilege, on these like kind of foundation boards, they love hanging out with artists. They're like it, and that kind of social capital, you can't monetize that. It's the what you're bringing in terms of your creativity and your dynamism and your curiosity and your interest, is invaluable in those kinds of circumstances. I've made a lot of really important fundraising connections through being an artist, because people are more interested in talking to me about their art career and getting some guidance on their art career, than they are about like talking to some business person about like how they're gonna like get a super high return on their investment. Like that's not as interesting for them. So that's something else that I think is like actually a huge benefit working as any kind of administrator, especially in any nonprofit. Like having that background really gets you into some rooms that you might not have been able to get into otherwise.
Hmm. That's so interesting. Okay, my next question is we've touched on a little bit in terms of like what are the skills or kind of temperaments or behaviors that are valuable in administrative work and for like people running these large institutions or projects. And my question now is do you have an idea of what you think the roles of administrators are in the community and what kind of like community member you try to be in your role as administrator? Maybe Tori will go to you first.
Yeah, I do. I thought about this a lot.
Hmm.
Um, a little while ago, my 4-year-old asked me what my job was, and having like answering that to a 4-year-old is so fascinating because um, the parents who he was like looking up to was like, so and so's dad is a doctor, and it was like, yep, that's a job that makes sense. Um, so when he was asking me, I was like, how do I explain to a 4-year-old like what I'm doing on the Canada Council portal for 17 hours a day?
Yeah.
And I told him that mom's job is to get as many art supplies as possible for all of the artists so that they don't have to think about where the supplies are coming from and they can just make the art. And he was like, absolutely, it makes perfect sense. Like he really connected with that. But then I started thinking, like, I do think that I have so many roles and I do such different things at each organization, but at all of them, like that's the core of it is removing as many barriers as possible.
Yeah.
Because so much of what it takes to get the money
Mhm.
or the literal things like the space or organizing the show, it's just like friction and walls and people telling you no. And I just go and pound people until they say yes. And like my dream scenario is that the artists who are involved see none of that.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that's really, really difficult, especially in a small community like this. We hold our arts administrators to a really, really high standard, and we are incredibly critical of them. And being critical of your arts organizations is important and valid and whatever, but uh, I think until you hold these roles, you have no sense of the amount of fires that people in like galleries and artist centers are putting out that you never see. The amount of times a funder comes to you and is like, maybe we're going to cut all the operating funding. And then you just save that and nobody ever sees it. And that's when you're doing amazing. When it looks like nothing is happening, that's when you're like peak excelling. And that can be like a really difficult thing to hold if you're putting too much stock in your reputation, which I've gotten better at. But that's regardless of how I'm accessing being an arts administrator, like what version of that role is, that's always my main goal, is to remove as many barriers as possible so that the artists only do the art.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Benny, what do you think? What do you think about the role of the arts admin or admin in the community?
I always think about at my convocation, I'm forgetting her name now. She's a like famous multimedia intermedia artist who used to work at NASCAD and now is out west. I will remember by the end of this talk, I swear to God. She was saying at our convocation that like working in the arts is like carrying a basket of kittens. And I think about that all the time because I think about administration and arts administration as a form of hosting. We're creating a container for people to play safely in. We're connecting the audience with the art, with the artists. We're taking care of the artist and the work and the context and the space, and so we're building the world that people can navigate a little bit easier, right? Like our work is to, like Tori said, like smooth things out, reduce those barriers. But to Tori's point, we're still working in an oppressive system and we're trying to like dismantle that system while also working in that system. And we're like arts administrators, I think, are like boss administrators compared, like now that I'm not working in just the arts, I'm like, whoa, we're so good at our jobs. Like so much better at our jobs than so many other sectors because we are at an intersection of the institutional powers and the people who are resisting those institutional powers. And that's where we play. We play between a rock and a hard place, but that rock is like moving whether we like it or not. So, I think of that role as like, how can I create enough guardrails that keep people safe and feel supported without restricting their movement and their desire to play. So that's kind of like how I see that negotiation is like, okay, like how can I connect this to this so that these resources flow and then that all works out? And like, how do I make all of these plays work together? It's a little bit like sports, where I'm just like coordinated. It's like somewhere between sports and conducting. I don't know. But there's like plays that we're doing, right? And you have to update your plays so that they work better with new systems. And with the people that you're playing with, you got to play to their strengths, right? So it's like building those relationships and community and understanding people's needs so that you can address them. And you're not always going to get that right. In fact, you're going to get that wrong like a lot of the time because that's what trust building takes, and it takes time and understanding each other. So it's really like, I try really hard, to Tori's point about like how we are very critical of our arts administrators. And now that I have a bit more space from the arts part of the administration, I have so much respect for what everybody does here because I'm like, wow, you are actually like, the bar is much higher in some ways. And in some ways, like we're just not compliant to the systems. And I love that about us. But I think that we really do need to like give a little bit more credit for how these institutions are navigating their own context and trying and continuing to try and support us, regardless of the fact that like they also don't have any money. It's not easy for them. And they are like just trying so hard to make it easier for everyone else.
The constant dance, the no money dance of arts administrators. But I mean, the interesting thing about talking to both of you is that you have these administrative roles and you're also artists. So I'd love to like maybe talk a little bit about the intersections of those skill sets or of those experiences. Are there things about the admin work that feed back into your practice, or are there kind of complications of navigating the community as an artist when you're also an administrator? What are the like productive points and tensions of being both administrator and artist in the same community? What do you think, Tori?
I think it runs both ways. Like the benefits are equal to the drawbacks. Um, Working in an artist-run center, particularly something like CFAT, where it was a production house. All of that was free to me at all times. Like everything was mine. But so the struggle of like affording to make work was gone, and I had so much at my fingertips. The other thing that was really helpful about working those jobs is you meet everybody. So if you want advice, if there's somebody you want to collaborate with, maybe they have like a good relationship with you now, like you have all of this stuff. Um, the downside is like I literally have been barred from doing so many things. Like for so long, I couldn't have any as a media artist in Nova Scotia, where the Center for Art Tapes is the only dedicated media arts organization. When you work there, you sign up for never ever having one of their opportunities ever. So that meant basically within our province, there was no opportunities for me. Moving into like where I currently am, like that sort of actually is one of the reasons I got more into narrative filmmaking, was because there was more opportunities for me in the sort of like more industry-based filmmaking. And then that led to, wow, and also you have these administrative roles, so we'll bring you over here. But now I work with aiff, but I also work with HIF. So there's two of our most major festivals that I can't ever show at, even though if I was just a filmmaker, they would be the people championing my work the most because they look out for Atlantic Canadian artists. So you bar yourself from a lot of opportunities. The other thing is that you do, I mean, going back to that sort of conversation about how we hold our administrators to a really high standard, you do also put yourself on this pedestal where people are always suspicious of your relationships from then on, no matter what. And that can become very difficult. Like years ago, while I was working at CFAT, I got one of my films into a really great slot at the film festival, and immediately somebody questioned whether or not it was like because I had some sort of organizational pull there, which I absolutely didn't at the time. I had zero. Or similarly, there, like people were really critical of like why you would get an opportunity. Is it because you were going to give an opportunity back in some other capacity? So I do feel like a sort of magnifying glass on why things come to me, and a sort of hypervigilance on explaining why things come to me. So that can be difficult. But the other benefit is that I think, like, you always know things before everyone else. I always know before your average artist does why Canada Council is doing some sort of like zany new granting system and what they're going to want out of it. Yeah. Like, I feel like I always have the secret sauce on how to get the money before the money gets released. And that's a huge help. That's a really, really big deal to know the sort of behind the scenes why the funders want certain things, having met the funders so many times, knowing how to talk to those people. You can really pull that into yourself as an artist.
Yeah, and that knowledge that both benefits the institution and your practice, like that kind of grant writing is like its own secret sauce, its own secret language that you have to navigate. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Betty, what about you? How do you feel about this intersection of artist and administrative roles in the community and how you navigate them?
I mean, this is a really interesting question for me because I feel like largely the administrative roles that I've taken on have prevented me from having an art practice. And I've had to really rethink what an art practice consists of for me, so that I can remain like, I'm like, no, I'm still creative. I'm still doing all of the things. I'm not selling any work. I'm not showing any work. but I'm still making things.
Mhm.
And that's been a challenge, like ideologically for my sense of self, is like when I take on these leadership roles, especially, they're so demanding that it's really hard to have creative time outside of them, especially when your executive functioning is like completely used up at work. And the last thing you want to do when you're off is like think about art.
Mhm.
I'm like, I would rather watch sports. Like I would rather watch men cry over balls. That it's just I don't have a lot left at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And it's like structurally really difficult, I think, for some administrators, like to Tori's point about the kind of there's a privilege in terms of your network, but then the conflict of interest policies at most organizations bar you from participating in anything. And so you kind of have to make your own path. And that's honestly like that's what you're gonna do anyways, probably. So it's fine. The thing that I'm running into now that I'm not in the arts, like working in an arts organization as an artist, the challenge and the suspicion there is that you're, as an individual administrator and an artist, you are competing with the people that you're serving. And that's, I think, where that suspicion can come from because you're like also in this privileged position of having employment and a network. So it feels like an unfair advantage. And now that I'm not working for an arts organization, the challenge now is how my art practice poses a reputational risk to the organization that I'm working for.
Ah,
Um, and so they now have concerns about what I'm making and sharing and exhibiting. So when you're working at a high level and interfacing with governments, multiple, and advising on like tariff relief and blah blah blah. And then you also make like collage nudes and like support Palestine with like
mm,
some advocacy and like sign making. That was part of the reason why I got off social media is there was like concern for my public support of Palestine on my personal socials. So there's a new political element to being an artist and an administrator, because you are representative of an institution, even if you are trying very hard to separate your identity from the identity of the institution. There is a real risk of people associating you as a human with that organization, and there are real concerns from more traditional organizations on how you are presenting yourself. And if your creative work is political in any sphere, that can pose a risk to their reputation. So that's something that I'm like working through currently and makes my work like either a lot less public, a lot less publicly available, or just like less interesting.
mm. That is a tough line to navigate. Well, I mean, it also brings up one of the points I want to talk about, and it's sort of like how all-encompassing these administrative jobs are. Like you're really kind of never off. Like you're very in demand all the time, and there can be I've seen and experienced like a pretty high rate of burnout and exhaustion in these kind of higher like project management and administrative roles. And I was wondering if you have both experienced or tried to create sort of systems of care either at institutional levels in where you were working or in kind of just like personal strategies that help you like imbue care into the job and keep yourself away or deter that burnout. Tori, have you navigated this at all in your work?
Constantly.
Yeah.
I think in my early 20s, I took everything like really, really seriously and like full stop, not about arts and men, everything. But I actually had this like really significant moment, which was probably such a throwaway moment for him, but I was at some group critique thing with James McSwain,
Mhm.
and people were getting really riled up about something, and like God knows what anymore, like no recollection. Everything that felt like a big deal at the time, I don't even remember anymore. But he leaned over to me and he said, "Do they know it's just media art?" And then I thought, like, oh yeah, that's right. And now I sort of try to remember that, like, ultimately, while I think that the arts are incredibly important and they are the reason for existing and living in communities and making healthy spaces, um, the sort of like harm of burnout and just the way that people can get kind of hateful when they're overworked, it's never, we've never in the history of art done something worth acting like that with each other. And I just don't have like any tolerance for it anymore. So I think I was already sort of on the path to recalibrating my boundaries around that kind of stuff. Uh, and then I had kids, and I feel like that really like just blew up my life in so many ways that ended up being like really, really good. Like kids are like, here's like a grand philosophy about life. I need you to learn it in like under 30 days because
Mhm.
you have to now. And I feel like a lot of the things I learned from them, I would have gotten to anyways. I just wouldn't have gotten to on that speed. But there's so much of that sort of like, I just don't have the option to work like that anymore.
Yeah.
That just is not accessible for me. And the
Mhm.
moment it became like a thing I couldn't access anymore, I realized I'm not less productive. Like so much of it was a choice. And it was this sort of like sacrificing yourself at the altar of art because it will make you more important thing.
Mhm.
And the people who have better work-life balance are not putting out worse work. They're putting out better work, if anything. So kids really got me there very quickly. But the other thing that they taught me is I think a lot of people when they become a parent, they have that thing where they're like, oh my God, my whole identity is gone. I had this whole identity and now it's gone because I'm a parent, and that's really scary and bad. But I've talked to other artists about this. But when you're an artist, you already do that sort of enmeshment with your identity with this one thing.
Yeah.
Like my whole identity is being an artist. And if I don't get into this show, it's not because the work sucks, it's because I suck and I'm a bad person. And I'm gonna like, get in bed and spiral about it for a long time. And then when I had like, oh, actually, you have to be the parent too, and that's a really meaningful identity, and you have to click into that, I suddenly was able to be like, I don't have to put all of my self-worth into this. Like, that was an option this whole time. And it gives me so much more perspective to sort of, sit back on that. So there's a lot of just the perspective part, but then there's also, particularly when I was at CFAT and I was the boss and could make policies and just enact them. There's so many things that structurally are incredibly easy to do that I like 4-day work week, give everyone some time to do their laundry. It's not that hard. Nobody's working less. We put in top up policies for sick leave, for parental leave, like
Mhm.
all of these things. You just figure out the numbers, you just budget.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of pretending that these things are incredibly hard. Like, how would we ever work 4 days a week? And then you just do it, and it's actually like super chill. So much of burnout is a choice by whoever is in charge of making the working conditions.
Mm.
And the danger becomes when we as people in the arts pretend it's not a choice.
And I think that so much of I think parents and especially mothers face a lot of barriers in the art world sometimes. Like there's not, the residencies don't accommodate them. There
Yeah.
may not be mat leave at their institution. So to hear that that was something you were thinking about structurally, I'm sure had a big impact both for you and for the people at the institution after you,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, and I also just like really want to like stop on that for a second because I hear that all the time. There might not be mat leave at their institutions, but there's not a top up at their institutions.
Ah,
And something that I think is really important about the way that we use our language, especially around mothers, is often we like slip into this thing where we talk about culture as if it's a rule.
yeah.
And there's so many legal rights that organizations are just pretending you don't have because you don't
Yeah,
know how to ask for them.
that's
And
right.
that was the thing that like really got me going when I started like putting those policies in place for myself, because I was the first employee in CFET's 40-year history to ever have a child. So there was no, there was
Yeah.
that to have a child while working the job.
Yeah.
Obviously, lots have gone on to have a child. But it was interesting to me when I would ask people at other arts organizations like how they were making that work. They'd be like, we're not allowed to take that kind of time off, or we're not allowed to do whatever. And I would say, like, well, legally, yeah, like
Mhm.
you can't, that we do. So um, that's the other thing about, like, I sort of relate that back into what I was saying about burnout being so much of a choice, is
Mhm.
that it's a culture around keeping us confused about this stuff.
Mhm.
Like, how
And
many
getting,
people in arts organizations understand how overtime pay works? Like,
yeah, getting us out
Yeah,
of this
there's only
martyr.
loo time.
What's that?
There's only loo time.
Yeah. And there's like a big martyr mentality of like, I'm throwing myself on the sword constantly to help this institution, this community. And yeah, and I think it's harmful. I think it hurts everyone involved. So it's really great to hear that there are strategies to avoid it and to like get ourselves out of this.
Yeah,
Ben,
I
are
agree.
you resonating with this? Yeah.
I like there are parts for sure. But I think for me, like I can so clearly validate that like the burnout is kind of like implemented
Mhm.
by the expectations of managers. You know, that and that is like a management failure, in my opinion. As like in any case, sometimes I think that the burnout is a choice of martyrdom, but it's also an expectation that we
100%.
have culturally of administrators to be like, no, you just do the work. You
Yeah.
just self-sacrifice because it's important. And you don't make enough money because you get to enjoy what you do, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, and like, and also there's it's not just the cultural pressure to martyr yourself. There is a real expectation from funders for you
Mhm.
to be delivering more than they're paying you for, like very like not even like shadily but like transparently, like we will only give you 50% of what you need to deliver all of these things, and we actually expect more than what you've proposed, and so we're actually going to come back and tell you you didn't do enough, so we want more for free. The number of times I've had to like tell government program officers like I cannot do more work for you for free in the
Mhm.
last 6 months. And then like the culture of employees is to just be like, yeah, okay, like we need to make them happy, people please, like the government, because we still need their money, you know, like, and I'm just like, no, no, like this is not a relationship that I'm willing to continue. I am not going to be used by these people. Like we can have a relationship where like I'm doing work for you and you're benefiting from that, and you know we can have a reciprocal dynamic. But the expectation that I'm just gonna like figure it out and self-sacrifice and work a bunch of overtime and not get paid, like that's I'm like not on for that anymore. And but it's just it's a cultural thing on top of like a choice, because there's a real expectation of many managers that you'll just like work as much as they want you to without any boundaries. And the number of times I've had like this is something that I'm really passionate about because I went through a really scary level of burnout when I was at Vans during the pandemic, because like that was unexpected. And you know, suddenly I'm in like meetings with Dr. Strang every 2 weeks, and the province is like, develop a reopening strategy for the cultural sector. And I'm like, oh, with what money? And they're like, oh, never mind.
Mhm.
You know, just like just the level of decision making, and also trying to deal with, you know, the culture crisis that was kind of revealing all of the oppression in all of our systems, and then being one of the people who is required to enforce oppression and the oppressive systems by regulatory bodies. So, you know, something that I noticed and experienced was I burnt out spectacularly. I had to be hospitalized. I had to take months off of work because I was so physically unwell. because I wasn't prioritizing my own well-being. And it was really hard for me to have boundaries with work. And my board couldn't really tell me what I could say no to. So I just had to say yes to everything. So I think since then, that made me realize there's a systemic failure that disproportionately affects folks with equity deserving identities in leadership. So that's why I developed my consulting company, was to work with internal candidates for leadership to coach them into those positions, but not just to coach them into the position of having to do the thing that sucks, but to actually work to restructure that organization so that it's more sustainable for people. So that's part of the reason why I'm so excited to work with IONS now, is that, when I was an arts administrator, to Tori's point, IONS was the organization that was like giving me the policy I needed, without having to like do all the research and do it myself. And like when I never had time to do that, like IONS was like, here is the 4-day work week and here's how you can do it. And here's how you can do a health plan with no money. And like here's some other resources. And now I'm getting to work with this incredible team of super highly skilled, very dedicated humans on how can we develop a system that supports leadership so that there is less burnout structurally, and how can we distribute that leadership, and have more lateral leadership so that we're collaborating at a high level and it's not all on one person's shoulders. So that's like something that I'm like really stoked to be working on so that we can develop some better systems that other people can adopt, so that we're not just losing people over and over and over again, and then we can't actually deliver on the impact. We can't, every time we lose a staff person, we lose, at least 6 to 12 months of innovation, if not more, so I'm really excited to try and find new pathways and new ways of working together that actually contributes to administrators' well-being, so that they can actually support everyone else's well-being in a more sustainable way.
Think of the administrators, people. Tori, you've already spoken to this, but before I turn it over to questions, do you have anything else you want to add about this idea of boundaries and care and this kind of like in these leadership roles?
Mm. I the the thing that's really tricky about boundaries is I feel like I have excellent boundaries now. And I feel proud of that. But something I think about a lot, and it's a really difficult question, is like, would I be where I am and also able to enforce the boundaries I enforce if I had not gone through 5 years of taking what was given to me?
That's right.
I don't know that. I don't know that that's true. So it's so easy for me to sit here and be like, here's how I do everything. And then you'll never be mistreated. But like, if I was 21 and asking for my first opportunity and was like, but also when you stop paying me, I go home, would I have gotten the opportunities I got?
Probably not.
Yeah, hard to say. So like, there's a little bit of privilege into being able to do that at all.
Yep.
No, that's very tricky, but I hear what you're saying.
That's so depressing, guys. I'm sorry.
But you have to have a certain level of privilege to say no, right? And that's something that I like train my staff on a lot, is like, okay, like you might not actually be able to say no to your boss because they're your boss and they get to determine what work you do. But what you can say is, if you want me to do this, you have to tell me what I'm not going to be doing, because I can't do it all. So you have to help me figure out what your priorities are.
Right.
This is really good advice. We've got a few more minutes. I can always ask more questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions of Benny and Tori. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, feel free to pop in the chat or raise your hand if you've got anything you'd like to know about business, about leadership, about administration. Now's your chance.
I feel like my life took a wild turn to give advice on business. Like when you sign up for art school, that's not where you think you're
No.
going.
No, but I have to say that like working with artists and working with people with MBAs I'm like, wow, artists are so much better at business than they give themselves credit for. Like the amount that they can figure out with no money, and very little like support or strategy or like liquidity.
Mhm.
I'm just like, oh no, 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 no. These people should be managing organizations because they know how to run things without resources.
Mhm.
And they know how to like handle the ups and downs and can pivot creatively, and most people, even with MBAs, they're like, there's a path and you follow the path. Or
Mhm.
like maybe you pivot, but like it's still profit.
Also, like the arts is kind of a bad product, like
Yeah,
genuinely, like trying to get people to give money to an arts organization. It's you have to be a bit of a scammer.
yeah,
And
sell
because
it really well.
it's not a great product in the sort of like business sense. And then if you find yourself in a situation where you have to like sell a beer, I'm like easy peasy, like it's not a big deal. Like it is like the hardest thing to sell in a lot of ways.
That's right.
I think people underestimate, yeah, the scrappiness of artists that we have to like make do with so little and that we are trained to problem solve, and it all lends itself well to a business and to kind of leadership role, I think, as you're both saying.
Mhm.
Oh, here, okay, we've got a question. Um, Lindsay in the chat is saying, I hate to be the person who says this isn't actually a question, but here I go anyway. I really appreciated everything said today. As an ASCAD grad and arts administrator, I felt a serious kinship. Ha ha ha. Thank you
Oh,
both.
that's so nice.
Yes, anyone who's worked admin knows all of this was very, they felt this for sure, me included.
There is a real kinship, like
Yeah.
genuinely. Like I wrote a blog recently about how organizations are struggling right now, nonprofits, and if you're new to leadership, these are probably some of the things that you're dealing with. And I have to say, like, the thing that sustains me is community, like
Hmm.
being able to feel seen by the other administrators and being like, yeah, that really sucks. Or actually, like, let me help you.
Hmm.
The amount of people willing to help you out, like administrators, they're like, that's literally their jam. So unless they're like way past their capacity and super burnt out, they're usually like, if I can't do it, I'm going to connect you to someone I know who can,
Hmm.
so like really tap people's shoulders as much as you can.
Mhm.
It's made me, not that I was ever like unkind or impatient with administrators, but it's made me extra kind and extra patient because I've been in their shoes and I know how many fires they're putting out and how many balls they're juggling. And it makes me also like big red flag when I see anyone be like nasty to administrators. I'm like, you don't understand how important they are and what they're doing. We need them. Be nice to them. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Any like tidbits of advice for any NASCAD students that might be watching this and are interested in entering these kinds of fields? Any like tips or tricks you have for them, Benny?
That's like very NASCAD specific advice I would love to give.
Yeah, do it, do it.
I found that when I was at NASCAD, and it's hard to speak to this now because who knows what's changed. Like maybe it's a
Mhm.
completely different school. A lot of my profs don't exist there anymore. But it felt like NASCAD presented me a very, very specific idea of what success was that mostly doesn't actually exist in the real world.
Right.
Of this sort of like being an artist and showing and subsist, like existing solely off of grants and
Mhm.
existing beyond even just the like it's showing all the time thing, but like showing only at very academic places.
Mhm.
And I had to like really, I think I watched a lot of people that I graduated with really struggle with this idea of like whether or not they were successful. And watching so many people at CFAT come from NASCAD and then I would like watch them get accolades and things are happening for them. They were like at CFAT because they're working on their solo show and they couldn't deal with this idea that they had not been successful because they still had to go be a barista after they were done this.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
there is such a freedom in understanding that so much of what is sold to you at NASCAD only exists for people who have somebody supporting them.
That's right.
You have to free yourself of that idea. And the moment you free yourself of that, like it's so much easier to celebrate your wins and take yourself out of that system. And I really feel like I'm there now, but like it took me a moment to get there. And a big sort of trap you can fall into if you've been sort of raised as an artist in that system, which I think NASCAD does so much, is that I often, when I was like early in arts administration things, if people spoke to me really academically and spoke down to me and I didn't understand what they were saying, and I'm not trying to be like sly when I say that. I mean, like genuinely, I don't know what you're talking about. I would often think like, I'm not smart enough to be in this room. I don't know what I'm doing here. Like everyone here has got something going on that I don't have going on. Maybe I need to go get an MFA and try harder to be a smart person. But the more I've like grown up and watched people be successful and other people be not successful, I realize how much of that sort of like need to be hyper academic and speak down to people is just insecurity for people who are like very, very not confident in what they're doing. It is the biggest red flag that somebody is going to be difficult to work with. They are not going to come through for you. So now I don't work with people like that. And another thing I think about very often is if we just like had a talk tomorrow on Zoom and I brought in like a bunch of NASA astronauts, they would be able to explain to us how rocket ships work. And anyone who is like very knowledgeable in what they do can explain it to anybody. And if somebody refuses to explain what they are doing to you, they are not a person with like any integrity that you should work with. And that's like 100%. If I can only give one piece of career advice to myself at 21, that's the one I would have given myself on graduation. If somebody makes you feel like an idiot, you get out of there. Not the path.
That's right. Yeah.
Benny, what about you?
I mean, the one piece of advice I usually give recent grads is just like try to be kind, because, you know, curators, administrators, folks that are gatekeepers that are in positions of power, it doesn't matter how good your work is if you're hard to work with. So, you know, if you are consistent, available, friendly, curious, flexible, you know, you're gonna get more opportunities because people are just happy to work with you. We spend most of our waking hours working. And so if we're working with people that are like giving us a hard time all the time, you know, that like that's just not a life that we're going to want to lead. So I think, you know, just being open and flexible and kind will get you so much further, than like it's the relational aspects, right? If you can have a strong working relationship with the people in your community, you know, your work doesn't have to be perfect. And those people will support you in getting your work to a place where like everyone is really proud of it and is advocating for you. So, you know, I think it's really just those relational pieces, of like, don't be a diva, like, you know, be a collaborator. That's really, I think, my one piece of advice.
Well, those are both very sage pieces of advice. Thanks, Benny and Tori. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a treat to hear from you both. And everyone who's watching this, please join us next time for artwork. And yeah, big thanks again to Tori and Benny.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks, guys. Bye.